May 28, 1940. The air in Berlin's Reich Air Ministry was heavy with cigar smoke and victory. France was collapsing. The Wehrmacht was unstoppable. And Hermann Göring, resplendent in his white uniform and gold baton, was laughing. He had just finished reading an American intelligence report claiming that President Roosevelt wanted to build 50,000 airplanes a year. He slapped the paper down, his rings clattering against the polished table, and barked to his staff. "They think they can frighten us with this nonsense? Americans, they know nothing of war production. Let them try to turn their car factories into aircraft plants. They will learn soon enough." The room joined his laughter, echoing through the marble corridors like a choir of arrogance. To them, the United States was a land of jazz, chewing gum, and amateur soldiers, not engineers of war. What Göring didn't know and could not imagine was that halfway across the Atlantic, a man named William Knudsen was already proving him wrong. In Detroit, the smell of oil and steel hung over the city like a second atmosphere. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had once earned a fortune as president of General Motors, now worked for $1 a year, Roosevelt's $1-a-year man. He stood inside a cavernous Ford plant, watching sparks fly from welding torches. Behind the thunder of presses, he saw something Göring could not. A nation still at peace, yet preparing for the hardest war in history. When Roosevelt had addressed Congress on the 16th of May, 1940, the Germans were racing through France. The world seemed doomed to dictatorship. But the president's voice that day carried a defiance that history would remember. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." Even his allies had doubted him. America had built just 3,611 military aircraft the previous year, a number so small it seemed laughable compared to Germany's armadas. But Roosevelt wasn't making a promise. He was issuing a challenge to the American soul. Knudsen accepted that challenge like an engineer accepts gravity as a law to be mastered, not feared. He walked factory floors where Chevrolets had once been assembled and imagined bombers rolling down the same lines. He knew that the secret of victory wasn't in ideology, but in process, in how fast one could design, cut, weld, and rivet. The Germans had discipline. The Americans had imagination. He believed that, given the chance, imagination could outbuild fear. By summer's end, Roosevelt's circle knew there was only one man for the task. When presidential advisor Bernard Baruch was asked who could make 50,000 planes, he replied, "First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen." It was more than flattery. It was faith in a man who understood machinery like a conductor understands his orchestra. Knudsen began drafting plans that would transform America's industrial heartland into a symphony of production. Car plants would become aircraft plants. Tool and die shops would become weapon foundries. The nation of consumers would become a nation of makers. In Berlin, Göring's officers still celebrated victories on the map. Their reports described the British on the brink and the Americans as hopelessly slow. Yet intelligence cables from Washington warned that American factories were changing. General Friedrich von Boedicker, the German military attaché, had tried to tell them. His dispatches spoke of assembly lines multiplying, of engineers training armies of workers. But the messages were dismissed as defeatist. Hitler himself had laughed. "Americans," he told his staff, "are half Judaized, half negrified, incapable of true war." Prejudice had blinded them completely. Meanwhile, in the roaring heat of Detroit's foundries, Knudsen's transformation had already begun. He stood before rows of machines, drills, lathes, presses, and saw not tools of trade but weapons of democracy. He believed that freedom could be measured in horsepower and that every worker's hand on a rivet gun was a blow struck against tyranny. To him, Roosevelt's goal of 50,000 planes was not propaganda. It was a blueprint for survival. By December 1941, America would already be producing 2,000 aircraft a month, 20 times the output of 1,939. But on that spring day in 1940, no one in Berlin knew it yet. Göring had looked at a piece of paper, scoffed at a number, and laughed. That laughter, as history would later show, was the sound of an empire sealing its fate. The first hum of transformation began not on battlefields, but in the dim corridors of American factories. In early 1941, while German tanks rolled across Europe, America's assembly lines began to roar awake. The sound was familiar: engines, stamping presses, pneumatic hammers, but the rhythm had changed. Detroit's heartbeat was no longer automotive, it was martial. Every spark that leapt from a welder's torch was a whisper that the sleeping giant had begun to stir. William Knudsen was everywhere: Detroit, Seattle, Long Beach, his shoes dusted with sawdust and aluminum shavings. He wasn't a general, but he commanded more divisions than any field marshal ever could. Workers, machinists, draftsmen, women who had never before held a wrench. He carried Roosevelt's vision like a private gospel, convincing businessmen that the war would be won not only with courage, but with cylinders and rivets. When people told him 50,000 planes were impossible, he simply smiled and said, "Then we'll make it possible." Ford's engineers laid out the plans for Willow Run, a bomber plant so vast that it seemed like an act of defiance against nature. It would be the largest factory under one roof in the world, 3.5 million square feet, a mile-long assembly line, an industrial cathedral rising from Michigan farmland. Boeing expanded its Seattle facilities, and Douglas Aircraft began hiring thousands of new workers, some of whom had never seen an airplane before. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt would soon call it, was being born one tool, one shift, one trembling hope at a time. But even as the machinery of freedom began to hum, Berlin's corridors remained filled with laughter and arrogance. Reports from the German military attaché, General Friedrich von Boetiker, painted a clear picture. American factories were mobilizing, engineers were retooling, women were entering the workforce. In December 1940, he warned that American war production will reach unimaginable heights. His cables crossed oceans and landed on desks that refused to believe them. Göring waved them away, muttering about American decadence. Hitler ranted about racial purity. "They are not warriors," he shouted. "They are merchants. They cannot sustain war." The truth was staring them in the face, but ideology had already made them blind. Knudsen, meanwhile, found beauty in the chaos of progress. He walked among drafting tables littered with blueprints and coffee cups, where young engineers argued over wing spars and fuselage stress loads. He loved their optimism, their belief that machinery could answer tyranny. At night, he often stood outside the plant gates watching thousands of workers leave under the glow of sodium lamps, their faces streaked with oil, their eyes tired but proud. They didn't yet know it, but they were forging the weapons that would one day darken every German sky. As 1941 approached, new factories appeared like steel forests across the Midwest. In Kansas, Douglas workers built aircraft fuselages beside wheat fields. In California, Lockheed hung banners reading, "Speed is life." In Michigan, Ford engineers developed hydraulic riveting tools and prefabricated wiring harnesses to simplify aircraft assembly concepts unheard of in aviation before Knudsen's reforms. The automobile industry had turned its genius toward the sky. Inside the White House, Roosevelt watched the numbers climb with quiet satisfaction. The country was still officially at peace, but he knew better. Every plane that left an American factory was a declaration of readiness, a silent promise that democracy would not go gently into history. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he had said in one of his fireside chats. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." And America listened. Housewives began collecting scrap aluminum. College boys volunteered at machine shops. Children brought tin toys to recycling drives. The whole nation was being reforged. For the first time, factory workers, engineers, and farmers felt like soldiers fighting the same war, only with hammers instead of rifles. Across the ocean, Göring's staff continued to sneer. Their intelligence officers dismissed reports of American women in aircraft plants as desperation, of factories running 3 shifts as exaggeration. "They cannot keep this up," one Luftwaffe analyst insisted. "Democracy lacks endurance." But endurance was exactly what democracy possessed. While totalitarian command forced obedience, freedom inspired cooperation, and cooperation, once awakened, could outbuild any dictatorship. By late 1941, the proof was undeniable. From a nation that had once built just 3,600 planes a year, America now rolled out 2,000 every month. Every hour, another bomber's shadow stretched across the hangar floor. Knudsen didn't smile often, but on one of those nights, standing in the roar of Willow Run's first engines, he whispered to a colleague, "We're not just building airplanes, we're building momentum. And momentum wins wars." Somewhere in Berlin, Göring still laughed, dismissing it all as propaganda. But if he had stood inside those factories, felt the heat, seen the movement, and heard the ceaseless hammering of a free people arming themselves, he would have realized the truth. The arsenal of democracy had awoken, and the sound of it was unstoppable. When the first bomber rolled out of Willow Run, it was a disaster. Its wings were crooked, its rivets loose, its systems faulty. The factory that was supposed to be a miracle of speed and precision had become a monument to chaos. Critics sneered and called it, "Will it run?" a cruel twist on its name. But to the men and women who worked there, failure was not final. It was simply the first draft of success. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, walked the factory floor every night. He carried a notebook filled with sketches of redesigned tools, faster jigs, better ways to train new workers. He had promised 1 bomber every hour, a pace no one believed was humanly possible. Yet he kept saying it 1 an hour, like a prayer whispered into the noise. Around him, the plant roared with the energy of 20,000 workers, welders, riveters, electricians, mechanics, many of them women who had never touched machinery before. The air was thick with the smell of oil and burnt metal, and every shift felt like a battle against time. In those early months of 1942, chaos ruled the assembly lines. Half of every B-24 bomber built had to be torn apart and rebuilt. Tools broke. Blueprints changed faster than engineers could adapt. One worker remembered, "We'd finish a wing section only to learn it was obsolete before we even riveted it shut." Morale wavered, but something else began to grow stubborn pride. They were learning by doing, failing forward, and in that failure, they were becoming unstoppable. Ford's engineers began breaking the B-24 into smaller sub-assemblies, treating each bomber like 100 different cars that could be built simultaneously. They introduced hydraulic riveting guns, prefabricated wiring harnesses, and color-coded parts to make complex systems manageable. Every week brought another innovation, another small victory against impossibility. In 1943 alone, Willow Run absorbed 578 design changes and never stopped production. By spring, the rhythm of the plant had changed. Where confusion once reigned, choreography emerged. Conveyors moved wings into fuselage bays like clockwork. Women riveters, some barely 20 years old, hit accuracy rates above 99%. Mechanics could assemble an engine blindfolded. The sound of thousands of hammers became music, the anthem of a nation rebuilding itself through sheer determination. Outside the plant, the Michigan night glowed faintly red from the foundry fires. Knudsen visited often, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes alive with pride. "See," he told Sorensen, "they're learning faster than anyone thought possible." And Sorensen, standing beside him under the mile-long roof, nodded. "When this line finds its rhythm," he said quietly, "nothing on earth will stop it." By late 1943, Willow Run was producing 148 bombers a month. By December, 365. And in April 1944, the miracle finally happened. 428 B-24 Liberators in 1 month, one every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. The impossible promise had become reality. News reached Berlin through intelligence channels. Göring refused to believe it. "Lies," he snapped, "propaganda to boost American morale." But the Luftwaffe's own pilots began whispering the truth. In North Africa and over the Mediterranean, skies once filled with German eagles were now crowded with American bombers more every week, as if the clouds themselves had joined the war. For the workers at Willow Run, those bombers were personal. They named them after sweethearts and hometowns: Mary Lou, Spirit of Dearborn, Liberty Bell. Each one carried a piece of their sweat and hope into the sky. One woman riveter said, "When I see them fly overhead, I feel like I've touched history with my own hands." They had. The world's largest factory, once mocked as a failure, was now outproducing the entire German aviation industry. Every 63 minutes, another answer to tyranny thundered into the air. And the man who had laughed in Berlin 4 years earlier was beginning to run out of reasons to laugh at all. The first time German pilots saw it, they thought it was a mirage. In the cold blue above Tunisia, December 1942, Major Johannes Steinhoff of JG-77 banked his Messerschmitt through a rising column of contrails and saw the horizon blur into a moving wall of silver. Bombers, hundreds of them flying so tight that their formation seemed to bend the sunlight. He had fought the British, the Soviets, the Poles. But this was something different. The Americans were coming, and they were coming in numbers that made courage irrelevant. When Steinhoff landed, he wrote simply in his logbook, "The Americans are no longer amateurs, and there are more of them every day." That line, carried quietly across the German Air Ministry, struck a nerve that no one dared name. Göring had promised domination of the skies. Yet each week, new reports arrived, enemy squadrons doubling, bombers impossible to count, factories that never seemed to sleep. The Reich's confidence, built on arrogance, began to tremble. By early 1943, the numbers no longer made sense. Germany was producing 1,000 fighters a month, losing 1,200. America, meanwhile, was producing 2,500 and losing only 400. Every air battle that year ended the same way: victory for the Americans by exhaustion alone. During Big Week, in February 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe shot down hundreds, but their own skies were falling apart. They lost not just planes, but men, veteran pilots, irreplaceable after a decade of war. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's top aces with 220 victories, later wrote about that winter mission over Brunswick. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless. That word hopeless had never appeared in German flight logs before. Now it became common. Back in America, the workers who built those bombers rarely saw the sky. They worked beneath it in factories that never slept, under lights that turned night into noon. Women now filled the assembly lines, 310,000 of them by 1943, 65% of the entire aircraft industry. At Douglas Long Beach, 22,000 of 41,000 employees were women. They wore coveralls and bandanas, their hands wrapped in tape, their hair smelling faintly of oil and detergent. They became legends, Rosie the Riveter and her thousands of sisters, driving 3,000 rivets a shift with 99.5% accuracy. Inside Willow Run, Rose Monroe, the original Rosie, hammered aluminum skins onto B-24 wings until her arms shook, but she never slowed. "This one's for my brother," she'd whisper before each takeoff. The bombers weren't just machines anymore, they were letters written in metal from free people to those who would silence them. Ford engineers redesigned tools for smaller hands and discovered they had accidentally increased efficiency. Pneumatic guns grew lighter, workstations grew safer, quality soared. What German intelligence dismissed as desperation women in factories turned out to be the Allies' secret strength. Precision improved, defect rates fell, and production lines found a rhythm that no dictatorship could match. Democratic strength had found its truest form: cooperation. Above Europe, that cooperation turned into thunder. On the 27th of January 1943, 64 bombers struck Wilhelmshaven, the first American raid on Germany itself. By October, at Schweinfurt, 60 B-17 seconds were lost in a single day, yet replacements arrived within 2 weeks. Losses that would have crippled any other air force barely slowed the tide. By 1944, the sky had become a factory floor without walls. Every hour another wave arrived, a procession of B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts and later P-51 Mustangs, whose engines roared like vengeance. The German people called it Der Himmel brennt, the sky is burning. For the first time, Berlin trembled not from artillery, but from arithmetic. Göring had promised that no American bomber would ever reach the German capital. By the summer of 1944, thousands flew over it every week. And in those darkened skies, filled with aluminum and flame, democracy proved its deadliest weapon: the ability to multiply. Every rivet driven by a woman in Michigan, every turbine forged in Ohio, every blueprint drawn by a young engineer at Boeing or North American Aviation, all of it converged in the air, over a continent that had once mocked freedom as weakness. The skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to the workers who had built them. And for the first time, Hermann Göring, once so confident, so amused, stopped laughing. By early 1944, the Third Reich was fighting shadows, its factories buried underground, its workers enslaved, its leaders whispering about miracle weapons that could never be built fast enough to matter. Göring, bloated and irritable, sat through endless briefings that offered excuses instead of hope. He still talked about the Me-262 jet, about secret projects that would turn the tide. But deep down, even he must have sensed the truth. Germany was running out of steel, out of fuel, out of time. The Jaeger program, the desperate attempt to disperse aircraft production across 700 underground sites, was supposed to save the Luftwaffe. In reality, it buried what was left of German industry under rock and delusion. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced into tunnels to build engines by candlelight, their breath turning to mist in the cold air. Some died where they worked, crushed by collapsing ceilings, or starved before their shift ended. Many found small ways to sabotage the parts they built, filing bolts too thin, miswiring control panels, or slipping sand into bearings. For them, destruction became the only form of freedom left. At Mittelwerk, 60,000 slaves labored to produce jet engines and rockets for the Reich. 20,000 never came out alive. The engineers above ground called the project the miracle of German will. But inside those tunnels, among the stench of oil and death, every broken part was a quiet rebellion. And when the engines failed in testing, when the rockets exploded on launch pads, the prisoners would close their eyes and imagine a sky where machines made by free hands might fly instead. Across the Atlantic, that sky was already real. Boeing's engineers in Seattle were refining modular construction for the new B-29 Superfortress, a bomber so advanced it could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything Germany had ever imagined. 4 plants worked on it simultaneously, each building sections that could be interchanged with mathematical precision. The process was a triumph of organization, proof that democracy could command chaos without crushing it. By 1944, America was producing 100 B-29 seconds every month. Each cost $65,000, a sum greater than the total budget of some German aircraft divisions, but the United States could afford it, and more. Where Germany was strangled by shortages, America swam in abundance. Steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Louisiana, aluminum from Tennessee, all flowing effortlessly along the arteries of rail and road. When reports of the Me-262 reached Washington, American engineers didn't panic. They responded. The Bell P-59 was already flying, and Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, sleek, fast, efficient, entered production before the war's end. While Hitler boasted about one jet squadron, America quietly built an air age. The contrast could not have been clearer. Germany built wonders it couldn't mass produce. America built ordinary machines in such quantities that they became extraordinary. Inside his command bunker, Göring's laughter had turned to muttering. He no longer mocked Roosevelt's speech about 50,000 planes. Now he stared at the figures in disbelief. One American factory, just one, was producing more aircraft than all of Germany combined. The Willow Run name, which he had once found ridiculous, now echoed in his mind like a curse. When the Allies crossed into Normandy on June 6, 1944, 11,000 aircraft filled the sky: bombers, transports, fighters, gliders. Germany could send barely 300 in reply. Even the most loyal officers stopped pretending victory was possible. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, warned Hitler that Germany was losing 1,000 planes a month while producing fewer than that. The Führer slammed his fist on the table, screaming that statistics were lies. But arithmetic doesn't obey ideology. In his final months as commander of the Luftwaffe, Göring drifted between denial and despair. At times he ranted that quantity means nothing without quality. At others, he admitted that numbers were everything. They outbuild us, outfuel us, outfly us, he told his adjutant one night after a bombing raid leveled part of Berlin. Even our miracles arrive too late. And yet, in those same weeks, across the ocean, a different kind of miracle unfolded. In Willow Run, women danced to the rhythm of machinery that never stopped. Riveters signed their names inside fuselages before the panels were sealed. Engineers, exhausted but relentless, shaved minutes off production time until the impossible was routine. When the 1,000th bomber lifted from the runway, its wings catching the red of a Michigan dawn, a roar erupted across the factory floor. They weren't cheering for war. They were cheering for proof that free people, when united, could outbuild tyranny. Somewhere in his bomb-scarred office, Hermann Göring received another intelligence report. Ford plant at Willow Run, now producing one bomber every hour. He read it twice, then folded it silently. For the first time since the war began, there was no laughter left in him. When the war finally ended, the skies over Europe were silent for the first time in years. The smoke had cleared, but the numbers remained cold, undeniable, merciless. Germany had built 94,000 aircraft during the war. America had built almost 300,000. One nation had enslaved millions and ruled through fear. The other had done the impossible through choice, cooperation, and courage. On May 8, 1945, Hermann Göring surrendered to the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. The once proud Reich Marshal, who had promised Hitler he would command the air, now sat in the back of a jeep, his uniform wrinkled, his medals dulled by dust. At first he was defiant, claiming Germany had been beaten not by skill but by sheer numbers. "Your machines overwhelmed us," he sneered. But German technology was superior. The American officer beside him said nothing. He knew that argument would die on its own. Weeks later, at the interrogation facility in Augsburg, Major Kenneth Heckler sat across from him, notebook open. Göring's voice was quieter now. "I knew American potential was great," he admitted, "but the execution exceeded my worst fears. That single factory at Willow Run, produced more bombers than our entire Luftwaffe at its peak. It was incomprehensible. He spoke of logistics with awe, the way America could feed armies 5,000 miles from home while Germany starved its own. "We couldn't supply troops 500 miles from Berlin," he said softly. "You supplied the world." His hands trembled as he traced invisible numbers on the table, as if trying to recalculate defeat into something he could understand. At Nuremberg, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Charts filled the courtroom. American aircraft production month by month, dwarfing Germany's entire annual output. Films showed the Willow Run assembly line, a mile-long river of machines moving toward daylight. As prosecutors read out the figures, Göring sat motionless. By 1944, the United States had built more planes every 30 days than the Reich had built in an entire year. He whispered. It seemed physically impossible. Psychologist G. M. Gilbert later wrote that Göring became obsessed with those statistics. He would spend hours in his cell comparing the capacities of factories, drawing ratios on scraps of paper. He called Willow Run that damned factory that broke our backs. When shown that America had produced over 800,000 aircraft engines to Germany's 240,000, he said nothing for a long time, only stared at the page as though staring into a grave. And perhaps he was. For Willow Run had not only built machines, it had built a message. 2 million Americans, men and women, black and white, immigrant and native-born, had worked in aircraft production at the war's peak. They were not conscripts. They were volunteers. Housewives, teachers, farmers, machinists. Their labor outperformed slave camps. Their precision exceeded military discipline. They proved that a free society, united by purpose rather than fear, could produce miracles faster than tyranny could imagine them. After the war, the factories that had once built bombers began building homes, cars, and machines of peace. The same aluminum that had formed the wings of the B-24 now shaped the roofs of America's suburbs. The same engineers who built the bombers designed the Saturn V rockets that would one day carry human footprints to the moon. The women who had riveted through the night raised children who became scientists, pilots, and inventors. The arsenal of democracy had become the engine of an age. The financial scale defied comprehension. 45 billion wartime dollars, 800 billion today, spent not to destroy a nation, but to defend an idea. America's unemployment vanished. Wages doubled. War bonds financed the very factories that printed them. The economics of despair had transformed into the economics of unity. Meanwhile, Germany's underground empire collapsed into dust. Slave labor, starvation, and terror had proven useless against cooperation and innovation. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, would later confess that America's attacks followed a definite system, reducing our production by 1/3, but the greater defeat came from their organization. Their factories thought faster than we could react. That, more than any bomb, was the true weapon of the war. On the night before his execution, October 15, 1946, Göring wrote his final letter. The Americans won through industry, not soldiers, he said. We were not defeated by bravery, but by factories. The nation we mocked for its consumer goods buried us under steel and aluminum. Hours later, he swallowed cyanide. But his last words lingered like an epitaph for the Third Reich. We declared war on an industrial giant while it slept. When it awoke, we were doomed. He was right. The man who had laughed at Roosevelt's call for 50,000 planes lived long enough to watch America build twice that number, and then some. 300,000 aircraft, a new world forged from furnaces and freedom. Each rivet, each engine, each bomber that rose from Willow Run carried a simple truth, that democracy, when tested, could outbuild tyranny, outthink fear, and outlast hate. The laughter in Berlin had long since faded. replaced by the thunder of engines built by hands that believed in something greater than power. And when the last B-24 rolled off the line, the workers paused for only a moment before returning to their benches. There was peace to be built now, and they already knew how.